Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into something that touches so many lives.
Huh.
Understanding and finding ways to overcome anxiety disorders.
That's right.
You've shared a stack of fascinating sources, including material discussing the work of Dr. Edmund Bourne and offering a very particular perspective on healing from these challenges.
Absolutely. And our mission in this deep dive is really to navigate these insights together, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge.
Right.
We'll compare the different approaches presented, get really clear on the distinctions these sources make between, say, fear, anxiety, and panic, and explore the different dimensions they highlight, including a pretty distinct spiritual framework for addressing these issues.
It's a powerful combination, isn't it? Because the materials you provided, they bring together discussions of established psychological tools alongside this, well, very specific spiritual lens for tackling fear and anxiety.
Exactly.
Let's start by looking at how your source material sets the scene, kind of framing these different paths to healing.
Okay. So the sources introduce us to Dr. Edmund Bourne, known for works like the Anxiety and Phobia Workbook and Healing Fear.
Right, I've heard of those.
Yeah. And what's compelling, I think, is learning that Dr. Bourne's path into this field was deeply personal. He actually struggled with anxiety himself.
Oh, wow.
And even after his initial success, his own journey led him to sort of reevaluate how he approached treatment.
And this reevaluation, according to the material, it led him to contrast two main approaches.
That's it. One is labeled applied technology, which, includes methods like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and medication.
Okay, it's standard stuff, maybe.
Sort of. And the other is simply called healing.
Just healing, okay.
Exactly. And the source offers a critique here, drawing from Bourne's experience.
No.
It suggests that this applied technology, while it might give you quick results, which is obviously valued in modern healthcare.
Sure, efficiency.
Right. It has limitations. The observation, as cited, is that when you look at it over, say, 1 to 3 years, the gains from approaches like CDT or medication often fade. Relapses are common. The material frames this as potentially a more superficial kind of healing, almost like saying, peace, peace, when, true peace isn't fully established underneath.
That distinction between a quick fix and deeper healing seems really central to the source's whole argument here.
It really is.
And this is where its unique spiritual dimension comes into play, isn't it?
Yes. The perspective here is that while something like CBT might align with concepts like repentance changing your thinking, it's seen as ultimately insufficient if the process doesn't involve God and acknowledge the reality of the spiritual world.
Okay, so that's a strong claim.
It is. The sources highlight Bourne's own conclusion that spirituality became important in his experience, and he believes it will increasingly shape future psychology.
Interesting.
But the material also adds a note predicting that this growing emphasis on spirituality in the field might not necessarily be Christian.
Oh, okay.
It cites figures like Dr. Deepak Chopra, who represents a different spiritual tradition, as an example of this broader trend.
So the picture painted is one where established psychology has its place, definitely. But the material you've shared argues for the necessity of integrating a specific spiritual reality, a Christian one suggesting others might fall short. That's the example with Chopra.
Exactly. It's a very clear framing of the ground we're going to cover.
Okay. Now, these sources are also very precise in defining terms, which I think is helpful. Before we go deeper, let's look at how they distinguish between fear, anxiety, and panic attacks.
Yeah, it's a really key starting point. Fear is presented as the most fundamental instinct, a natural built-in response.
Okay.
According to the material, it's God-given, actually, and it's a reaction to threats perceived as both imminent, meaning they are present, or very near.
Right here, right now.
Exactly. And potent, they have the power to cause harm. Okay, imminent and potent. So things like learning not to touch a hot stove after you get burned or stepping back from a high ledge. These are rational fears.
Precisely. They're learned responses, vital for survival. Reactions to clear, present, powerful dangers.
Makes sense.
Phobias, then, within this framework, are labeled as irrational fears.
Okay.
And the core idea presented is that overcoming them hinges on identifying the lie, underpinning their irrationality. Because, as the material puts it, truth sets us free.
Right. That phrase comes up.
It does. And fear, in this defined sense, always has a specific object. Fear of heights, acrophobia. Fear of enclosed spaces, claustrophobia. Crowds, agoraphobia. Poison, toxophobia. You get the idea.
Got it. An object.
And the rattlesnake analogy is used. A rattlesnake in the room that's imminent and potent, that prompts fear.
But a dead rattlesnake or one far away.
Exactly. The fear isn't warranted in the same way because either the imminence or the potency is missing.
Okay, so fear is tied to a specific, perceived, present danger. How is anxiety different then?
Anxiety, as described in these sources, is characterized as being like fear without an adequate cause. It often arises from uncertainty, from not knowing what's going to happen next.
That feeling in your stomach about the future.
Exactly. The material even dives into the Greek root of the word for anxiety, merimna. It breaks it down as meriso, divide, and knots mind.
A divided mind.
Yes. So anxiety is depicted as a divided mind, which leads to instability. And they link this to the biblical idea of taking no thought or being worried about your life, like in Matthew 6.25.
That picture of a divided mind really resonates. Fear reacting to a present threat, anxiety kind of wrestling with future uncertainty. What about panic attacks? Where do they fit?
Panic attacks are described as, intensely frightening and distressing experiences. They're marked by overwhelming physical symptoms of anxiety, or racing heart, nausea, difficulty breathing, maybe feeling paralyzed, chest pressure.
Yeah, really physical.
Very physical. They feel very much like fear, but often there isn't a clear, identifiable object that is both imminent and potent in the immediate environment causing it.
Got it. Okay, so we have clear definitions straight from the material. Fear response to an imminent, potent object. Anxiety, divided mind. Worry, like fear without that immediate cause. Panic attacks, intense physical surges, feels like fear, but often no clear object right there.
You summarized that perfectly.
Now, building on this, the sources propose something really interesting. That many irrational fears aren't actually distinct issues, but are maybe subsets of just three major fear objects.
Yes, this is where the spiritual framework becomes much more explicit. The material suggests that many irrational fears, even ones that seem unrelated, like claustrophobia or acrophobia,
Fear of heights, fear of small spaces.
right, they might actually be rooted in a fear of death, the fear of suffocating, the fear of falling to your death.
Wow, okay. Rooted in fear of death.
And the core argument they make is that understanding certain truth, specifically within a Christian belief system, can remove the potency of these fear objects, even if they remain potentially imminent.
So the power is removed, even if the thing itself is still around.
Precisely. Let's look at how this is applied. First, the fear of death. Physical death is seen as imminent. It's appointed for everyone, right?
Yeah, Hebrews 9.27, they cite.
Right. But its power to terrify is, according to these sources, removed by belief in the resurrection of Jesus. They cite 1 Corinthians 15, John 11.
Okay.
The material quotes Paul saying, "To live is Christ and to die is gain," and that famous line from the missionary Jim Elliot,
He's no fool.
who gives up that which he cannot keep in order to gain what he cannot lose.
Yeah. The insight here is that this understanding is presented as the key to freedom from the fear of death. It enables you to live freely now.
But they're clear it's not about wanting death. Right?
Oh, absolutely not. The material is clear this doesn't condone suicide. Life is seen as a stewardship. But the fear's potency is disarmed. Okay, so death is still a reality, but its ultimate terror is kind of neutralized by a belief in what happens after. That changes its power in the present moment, according to this view. What about the fear of people?
The fear of people. This is presented as the root of phobias tied to things like rejection, failure, abandonment, or even, death at the hands of others.
Social anxieties, performance anxiety.
Exactly. The material quotes Jesus advising to fear the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell more than those who can only kill the body. Matthew 10.28.
A shift in perspective on who holds ultimate power.
Right. It also links the fear of people, specifically fear of rejection or failure, to hindering action. It states it's the number one reason, in their view, that Christians don't share their faith. And it poses the question, is it rational to let this fear stop you from sharing what you believe is good news?
That's a very direct connection between an internal fear and an external action, or lack thereof, framed within that specific faith context.
Okay, and the third major fear object. The third is the fear of Satan. The material describes Satan as an adversary, citing 1 Peter 5.8, who is active but, crucially, ultimately defeated by Jesus, referencing 1 John 3 and Colossians 2.
Okay, an active but defeated enemy.
Yes. And a significant claim made here is that many people, perhaps unknowingly, fear Satan more than they fear God. Which, in this view, effectively elevates Satan as a greater object of worship simply through that misplaced fear.
Wow. What's striking here is how this framework takes what many would see as purely psychological phobias and reinterprets their root cause through this spiritual lens, and then proposes a spiritual solution, not just managing the fear, but disarming its power through a specific theological understanding.
That's the core of it.
Which leads us directly to the idea of the fear of God as the ultimate overcoming fear.
Yes, exactly. The sources argue that the fear of God isn't just a negative concept like being scared of God. It's presented as the beginning of wisdom, citing Proverbs 9:10. And it's seen as capable of overcoming all other fears. God is framed as the ultimate fear object precisely because he is omnipresent, immanent everywhere, and omnipotent, all-powerful.
So unlike the other fear objects where the sources say their potency is removed through truth, God remains both immanent and potent. Is that the idea?
That's exactly the idea. And the material suggests that worshiping God serves to reinforce his attributes in our minds, which maybe paradoxically makes him our rightful fear and dread, but also, as described in Isaiah 8, our sanctuary, our place of safety.
It's a really radical reframing. Not getting rid of fear itself, but reorienting it towards the ultimate reality as perceived in this framework, which then somehow provides a foundation of safety.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, let's narrow our focus slightly to another specific area addressed, the fear of failure. That seems pretty universal.
Oh, definitely. The sources highlight this as a really widespread issue. There's an anecdote shared about asking pastors about their deepest fear. And the common response wasn't a fear of God, interestingly, but essentially a fear of failure.
Wow.
This fear is seen as a major distraction, preventing people from succeeding without being driven by that very fear.
So it's not just bad, it actually gets in the way of doing well.
Right. And the materials propose 3 principles for success that are presented as being independent of people or external circumstances.
Okay, what are those?
Right. These are 1, knowing God and understanding his ways, citing Joshua 1 and Philippians 3.
Okay, knowledge and understanding.
2, focusing on becoming the person God has called you to be. So prioritizing character over career, maturity over ministry, being before doing. They cite Philippians 3 again.
Character first, got it.
And 3, being diligent and faithful stewards of the time, talent, and resources God has entrusted to you, citing 1 Corinthians 4.
Stewardship. Okay, so it sounds like success in this view is defined much more internally and relationally, like playing for the coach, not the grandstand.
Exactly, focusing on obedience and stewardship.
And the sources also offer a specific definition of what failure isn't.
Yes, this is crucial. Stumbling or falling, even if it happens repeatedly, is not failure, according to Proverbs 24.16, as cited.
Okay, that's important.
Failure, in this context, is seen as refusing to take responsibility. You know, saying, I was pushed, or failing to learn from a mistake.
Ah, the learning part.
Yes. There's an anecdote about a CEO who treated big mistakes as, like, tuition paid for learning. It underscores that it's the absence of learning, not the presence of errors, that constitutes true failure here.
That's a really significant reframing. That could lift a heavy burden for a lot of people listening, I imagine.
I think so, too.
Now, based on this whole spiritual framework, what practical steps do the authors suggest for actively overcoming these irrational fears?
Well, the foundational step emphasized is reconciling with God, seeking spiritual alignment first, resolving personal and spiritual conflicts. They cite Psalm 34 here.
Starting with the relationship with God.
Absolutely. And there's a very powerful testimony included here. Someone who suffered for 35 years with intense fear and panic attacks.
35 years. Wow.
Yeah. Found little lasting help through traditional psychology or counseling despite multiple hospitalizations, but experienced freedom within just 3 weeks of addressing spiritual conflicts.
3 weeks.
That's what the source says. Even regaining the ability to read scripture, which had apparently become impossible for them.
That specific testimony really highlights the potential impact of the spiritual dimension for this individual as presented in the sources. It's quite dramatic.
It really is. Now, the material acknowledges that not all fears just vanish instantly. You know, ingrained patterns, learned behaviors often need to be unlearned.
Sure, that makes sense.
But it outlines 5 suggested steps within this Christian framework.
Right.
1, analyze your fears. Pinpoint the specific fear, its triggers, the root lie fueling it. And consider, based on the source's view, if the imminence or potency of the object can be addressed through spiritual truth.
Get specific about the fear and the lie.
2, analyze your lifestyle. How has fear shaped your behavior? Has it made you timid or maybe dishonest or caused you to succumb to peer pressure?
Look at the impact. Okay.
3, decide on a responsible plan of action. Prayerfully choose to confront the fear. The advice is to start small. realistically.
Like the elevator example.
Exactly. Someone afraid of elevators starts with just the second floor before tackling skyscrapers. They use the evangelism explosion training model, observe, participate, lead as an analogy for gradual exposure and growth.
Step by step.
4. If the fear involves a person, determine how you will respond to their potential negative reactions once you stop letting fear control you. Prepare for them maybe ignoring you, getting mad, even threatening.
Plan for the pushback.
And 5, commit to this plan, relying on what the sources describe as the power of the Holy Spirit. The material includes the quote, "Do the thing you fear the most, and the death of that fear is certain."
That's a strong quote.
And the key reframe here is this. You don't wait for the fear to go away before you live responsibly. You live responsibly despite the fear, and then the fear diminishes.
Action first, feeling follows. That's a clear, practical takeaway from this section, an active, faith-based approach.
Very much so.
How does the material address anxiety specifically then, and this idea of casting it on Christ?
Well, as we noted, anxiety is tied to that idea of a divided mind, worrying about temporal things, earthly things.
Right.
The sources connect this directly to Matthew 6, contrasting earthly treasures with heavenly ones, and the concept of having a clear eye or single focus versus being divided between serving God and serving wealth or mammon. The point emphasized is that a peaceful existence, free from anxiety, is rooted in relationships primarily with God than others not in possessions or circumstances.
So when your ultimate focus is divided, that's where the instability and anxiety, the divided mind, can creep in. Makes sense.
Exactly. The material then provides a 6-step process for casting anxiety onto Christ.
Okay, 6 steps. Let's hear them.
1. Turn to God in prayer. That's presented as the essential first step, citing Philippians 4.6.
Prayer first.
2. Resolve personal and spiritual conflicts. The idea is to draw closer to God and resist the devil, citing 1 Peter 5. The material suggests that giving attention to deceptive spiritual influences can lead to double-mindedness and anxiety.
Deal with conflicts. Stay close to God.
3. State the problem. Simply clarifying the source of the anxiety can bring relief. The point is made that worrying itself often takes a greater toll than the potential outcome.
Name it.
And there's also a warning against seeking ungodly counsel or, bogus remedies like happy hour or pet pills.
Avoid quick fixes that don't help.
Okay. 4. Divide facts from assumptions. While fear is often based on present facts, anxiety, in this view, is often based on assumptions, usually assuming the worst-case scenario which may not align with reality or truth.
Facts versus assumptions. That's key.
5. Determine what you have the right and ability to control. This is big. You are seen as responsible only for what is within your power to influence.
Only your part.
Right. Your sense of worth is tied to this responsibility. The sources suggest living irresponsibly can actually cause anxiety.
Oh, interesting.
And the crucial point is made. You don't cast your responsibility onto Christ, but you do cast the anxiety onto Him while you are living responsibly.
Okay, take responsibility, give God the worry.
That's it. And 6, list everything you can do that is your responsibility. Commit to fulfilling these obligations diligently.
Make a list. Do your part.
Any residual anxiety after taking these steps, according to the source, might stem from taking on responsibilities that weren't yours to carry in the first place.
Carrying burdens you weren't meant to.
Yeah.
That provides a very concrete way to break down anxiety within this framework. Identify the true source, own your part, and trust the rest.
Exactly.
Now let's move to panic attacks. The sources give this significant attention, particularly exploring a potential spiritual dimension.
Yes, they do. Panic attacks are described really vividly. The sudden terror, intense physical symptoms, heart racing, nausea, breathing difficulties, feeling paralyzed, chest pressure.
It sounds terrifying.
It is. The material notes how common they are, especially in women, often starting between 20 and 30, and the risk of agoraphobia developing afterwards.
And it does include some helpful physiological information too, right? About the body's response.
Yes, that the body's fight-or-flight system is reacting intensely, as if to a real threat. That initial gasp for air, trying to suck air in without exhaling properly.
Right.
It mentions that techniques like breathing into a paper bag can help re-regulate carbon dioxide levels and ease symptoms. Just understanding this physical process can make the experience less terrifying.
Knowing what's happening physically can help manage the fear of the attack itself.
Exactly. And a thorough physical checkup is also recommended to rule out things like mitral valve prolapse that can mimic panic symptoms. Sometimes just knowing a physical cause is minor can reduce fear of the symptoms recurring.
Good practical advice. But then the material pivots pretty hard to what it calls spiritual mysteries surrounding panic attacks. This is where its specific perspective becomes very pronounced.
It really does. It raises questions like, why the sudden out-of-the-blue onset? Why is it called anxiety when it feels so much like intense fear? Why do panic attacks sometimes happen during sleep? And why do some people, according to the source, experience instantaneous freedom just by calling on the name of the Lord?
Right, those are puzzling aspects.
The detailed testimony shared earlier is revisited here, noting the pattern of attacks coinciding with making spiritual commitments, waking abruptly from sleep, specific physical sensations like rushing sounds, hearing voices, screaming, feeling paralyzed, a heavy weight on the chest.
Yeah, the specific details are quite intense.
This leads the source to raise the possibility of demonic involvement in some cases.
Okay. And the material also mentions experiences shared at conferences.
Yes, where many people reported being sharply awakened around 3:00 a.m., which the source connects to a time some reads associated with negative spiritual activity in some circles. And many also described feeling overwhelmed with fear during the night, kind of half awake, feeling pressure, being unable to move or speak. Sleep paralysis type experiences, but interpreted spiritually.
Okay.
These experiences, in the source's view, can potentially be spiritual attacks. They're seen as often occurring when individuals are alone, vulnerable, or maybe making significant spiritual progress.
And the idea is that Satan's strategy is fear itself.
Yes, aiming to prevent people from drawing closer to God. That's the framework presented.
So the remedy proposed here is fundamentally spiritual then, and not just managing symptoms, but addressing a perceived spiritual cause.
That's exactly right. The material emphasizes that inward submission to God, citing James 4, is presented as the necessary precursor to outward resistance to the devil.
Submission first, then resistance.
Yes, and a key instruction is to call upon the name of Jesus aloud.
Out loud. Why out loud?
Well, the material suggests that while God knows thoughts, within this spiritual framework, spiritual adversaries aren't compelled to obey silent thoughts. They respond to spoken commands issued with the authority that comes from submission to God.
Okay, using spoken words as a form of spiritual authority.
Right. It's framed as using spiritual power, divine power, not worldly methods, citing 2 Corinthians 10.
And the material connects this to a biblical example.
Yes. The experience of Eliphaz in Job 4 is used as an example of dread and trembling in the presence of a spirit.
Okay.
And the source makes a critical point here, that these kinds of potentially demonic visitations are seldom discussed or explained in many churches, leaving believers feeling ill-equipped to understand or respond to them if they happen.
So it highlights a perceived gap in teaching or preparation.
Exactly. It underscores the source's strong conviction that many panic attacks, or at least some significant portion, have a spiritual root and require a specific spiritual response grounded in faith and direct spiritual action, as they've outlined.
It's certainly a perspective that offers a very distinct interpretation and a distinct set of tools for these really terrifying experiences.
It definitely does.
Okay, let's try and bring some of these threads together as we wrap up.
Yeah.
How do the sources connect fear, control, and maybe the role of the church in their concluding thoughts?
Well, the concluding thought is powerful, I think. Fear, as described in the source, makes people susceptible to manipulation.
How so?
It's seen as the handle that allows others to control them.
Fear is a tool for control.
Precisely. The material uses the example of discussions around terrorism, arguing that the ultimate solution, in their view, lies not just in external measures like security commissions, but in developing fearlessness within the human heart.
Interesting connection to broader societal issues.
And the source asserts that, from its perspective, only the church is truly equipped to provide adequate answers for anxiety disorders.
Only the church.
That's the claim. It warns that a congregation paralyzed by fear loses its effectiveness and its witness, citing Proverbs 28 and Acts 4.
So it brings the discussion full circle, framing fear not just as a personal challenge, but something with broader implications, a tool for control, and a significant obstacle to the perceived mission of a faith community.
Exactly. We've covered a lot in this deep dive, really navigating the specific sources you shared.
We really have.
We've looked at different approaches to healing from anxiety, including psychological methods like CBT and meds, and the sources' critique of them as potentially superficial without that spiritual component.
Right. And we clarified the distinct definitions of fear, anxiety, and panic attacks offered in the materials. That was really helpful.
Yeah, and explored the idea that many fears might stem from those three core objects: death, people, Satan, and how, according to this Christian perspective, theological truth can supposedly disarm the potency of these fears.
We also talked about the fear of God as an overcoming fear, those principles for success not dependent on external factors, and walk through the suggested spiritual steps for confronting fears and anxiety.
Including those practical actions and the specific process for casting worries onto Christ.
And finally, we really delved into the complex area of panic attacks, considering both the physiological responses discussed and the potential for spiritual attacks, alongside the very specific spiritual remedies proposed within that framework.
Yeah, this deep dive has really offered you a look at multiple lenses and some very specific insights and practical tools, all drawn directly from the source material you provided.
It absolutely has. So here's a thought to sit with as you process all this, drawn directly from the heart of the sources we explored today. Consider how the very nature of what you tend to fear or feel anxious about, whether it's an identifiable danger, maybe an uncertain future, or even something you perceive as spiritual. Consider how that might, according to these sources, be revealing where your ultimate trust is actually placed.
Where your focus really lies.
Exactly. And how shifting that fundamental focus, changing who or what is your ultimate fear object or your sanctuary, as suggested in these materials, could potentially reshape your entire experience of these profound challenges.